For those of us who've grown up in a Christian culture, we're used to hearing biblical stories and ethical teachings of Jesus. This close cultural proximity to Christianity has desensitized us to many aspects of the radicalism of his original meaning in his time. Since we're accustomed to hearing these ideas, they don't strike us as particularly troublesome. But in the ancient world, these were radical revolutionary ideas that were shocking and disturbing to people. The Danish religious thinker, Soren Kierkegaard, complained that our modern relation to Christianity has turned faith into a phenomenon which is significantly different from what it was at the beginning. Specifically, we tend to regard some of the teachings of Christ as entirely straightforward and intuitive. Since this is the case, it's relatively easy for us to be Christians. But Kierkegaard argues that this misses a key element in early Christianity, which he refers to as the possibility of offense. Jesus' teachings were highly provocative to many people at the time, who found them offensive. Kierkegaard's point is that we've lost this element of Christianity in our modern world. There is today nothing about Christ's teachings that strikes us as particularly offensive, yet Kierkegaard claims this is a necessary element for true faith. His conception of faith is that it's supposed to be something very difficult and not simply an obvious and natural conclusion to a series of thoughts or arguments. In the scriptures, this element of offense is indeed present. The word for offense in Greek is skandalon, which is sometimes translated as stumbling block. When John the Baptist's followers ask Jesus if he is the one that the prophecies say will come, he does not answer them directly, but instead says, quote, "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have good news brought to them. And blessed is anyone who takes no offense at me." Jesus himself thus recognizes that his teachings are potentially offensive to people. When Jesus returns to his hometown of Nazareth and preaches, the people recognize him and are astonished, since they know him as the carpenter's son. They reject his teachings, which seem strange to them. It's written, quote, "And they took offense at him." Thus, being offended means failing to accept his teachings. Not surprisingly, it's also said that the Pharisees were offended at the teachings of Jesus. He was a person who had no authority in their eyes with respect to religious matters. The Pharisees and Sadducees regarded themselves as being the experts in all questions of religion, and thus they perceived the success of Jesus' ministry as a threat to their own authority. They claimed that Jesus was a blasphemer who had no business teaching the people anything at all about religion. They were thus the ones who plotted against him and brought about his execution, whereas the Roman authorities were more or less indifferent to the matter and had a hard time understanding the degree of animosity that his teachings had caused among the Jews. But they had no desire to cause a conflict with the Jewish religious establishment, and so they allowed Jesus to be put to death. Offense, in some ways, seems to be the very opposite of faith. One can react in two ways to the teachings of Jesus. One can believe in them, or one can reject them. The latter alternative is indicative of the feeling of offense. But Kierkegaard's point is that these should not be conceived as absolute opposites. Instead, offense is a necessary condition for faith. It must be possible to be offended in order to have faith. Without the possibility of offense, faith would be obvious and natural. Instead, the radical and counterintuitive nature of much of Jesus' teachings make it difficult to accept. For Kierkegaard, true faith involves the arduous overcoming of this difficulty and not the omission of it. Jesus regularly rebukes his followers for a lack of faith. Even though they witnessed the miracles firsthand, they themselves had trouble believing certain things. For example, when Jesus walks on water, he commands Peter to come and join him. But Peter becomes afraid of drowning and calls out for help. Jesus says to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" So Peter's rebuked again, this time even more sternly, for calling into question Jesus' plan to go to Jerusalem and suffer persecution. "You are an offense to me, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." In the letter to the Galatians, mention is made of the offense of the cross. The idea here seems to be that it's difficult to reconcile the idea of Jesus being a divinity or the son of one with the idea that he was executed by mere mortals. If he were truly a god, then Surely he could have avoided this fate and saved himself. It's ideas like this that must be overcome if one is to have true faith. But we forget this if we take such ideas to be obvious and straightforward. This changes the meaning of faith, which is intended to be a difficult struggle. When we see images of Christ, he's often portrayed as a powerful figure who has overcome all obstacles. These images, according to Kierkegaard, make a mistaken conception of Christian faith. When one sees him as a strong and successful person, then it's easier to become a believer. But this is not what the original followers of Jesus saw. Instead, they saw a humble, vulnerable person who was tortured and executed. Faith becomes much more difficult when we keep this latter image in mind. But Kierkegaard insists that this is the true challenge of Christian faith. Kierkegaard also reminds us of the persecutions that the early Christians faced. Confessing Christianity could mean being jailed, tortured, or executed. Thus, Christian faith was not a matter that was taken lightly. It required a profound degree of conviction and determination in the face of the possible negative consequences. However, all of this has been eliminated in the modern Western world, where there are no penalties for being Christian. Kierkegaard claims that this leads to a deceptive conception of faith that makes it easy to be a believer. He believes this is a distortion of that is fundamentally at odds with the original nature of Christianity.